practiced a sending song for us too that they're going to help lead us in. So after our sending song, when we do the sending at the back, the kids are going to help us sing our final sending. So they're just doing all kinds of stuff today. So here's the question everybody always asks me when we get to this part of the Sermon on the Mount, this section of the Bible. What does it mean for salt to lose its taste, and how does that possibly happen? And there's not a real great answer for that. It seems like the phrase is just one of those things that's really hard to translate. Although the idea of salt losing its saltiness, that's an older translation, salt losing its saltiness, is something that catches our attention every time. It's something we think about. So it can be translated as we have it in our New Revised Standard Version of how does salt lose its taste? Or I've heard it translated, when salt has lost its saltiness, with what can we salt it? Like, what can you put on salt to make it salty? But for me, even though it's not a direct translation, the easiest way to think about it is to think about one of the Greek words in this passage. And the word is moriano. Moriano is kind of this idea of the salt losing its taste. So it's a common word. It means low grade, not as good. It's actually the same word that gives us our really mean word of moron. It's the same line of thinking there. So if salt somehow becomes low grade, if salt somehow is not grade A best standard anymore, then if it's been contaminated or diluted, can it be fixed? And the answer is no, not really. It kind of takes a lot to do that. Now, I know we have some science people in here, and so we always get the thing of, well, if the contaminant is not water soluble and the salt is water soluble, obviously, all you have to do is dissolve it, filter it out, and then evaporate the water again. Okay. So, number one, good thought. If it can be separated, though, it hasn't truly lost its taste or become contaminated. At least that's my thought. That's what we're going to go with for right now. But basically, it can't be fixed. If anybody has ever spilt a beverage into a salt shaker, you know that the salt is done for at that point. It doesn't matter how long you let it dry out, it's never going to really act like normal salt again. And it's hard for us to think about low-grade salt because we pretty much just buy good salt. I mean, you go to the store and you get salt and it's salt. But it would have been a common thing for people in Jesus' day. Salt was a little bit scarce, not really scarce, but a little bit scarce. And it was valuable because it was a little bit scarce. The word for salt is actually where we get our modern day word for salary, because at a few times in places people were actually paid in salt. That's how valuable it was. So it was used for preserving many types of food before refrigeration, obviously. It was vital in making bread because it has something to do with how the yeast works. And perhaps the most important thing, and the one that we most often forget about because we always think about salt in food, is that salt was the most effective thing that most common people had for preventing infections and open wounds. So when people say, like, salt in a wound, they're probably forgetting that even though it does not feel good to put salt in a wound, that it has an element of protection and healing to it. So, and because of all that, people would have ended up with salt that was low grade back in the ancient world. Because if it had some salt in it, it was still going to kind of work if they couldn't get the high grade salt. And people would have also known that at some point, if it was contaminated enough, there really wasn't anything else to do with it You could throw it on the path and maybe it would stop the weeds from growing. So for us, when Jesus says that we are the salt of the earth, he is saying that we are pretty important. And the same goes for light. Back before the days of electric streetlights and tactical flashlights and as much light as you could possibly want in a room, it was something people thought about, that even the smallest light could illuminate an entire house in one of their small houses back then. And that without the light, the darkness could sometimes become very long and overwhelming. They also would have been aware of how the smallest light can keep animals out of a campsite. Even though that's not what it's specifically talking about, there's also that element of protection. But this thing about both salt and light is that they function very differently depending on whether they're concentrated or whether they're dispersed. They both have numerous amazing functions. They're both very vital to who we are, because everybody worries about getting too much salt in their diet, but not having enough sodium in your body has a whole bunch of problems too. So getting a big bite of salt does anything but make the food taste good. Salt must be dispersed and disappear into the food for it to have its desired effect. But on the other hand, concentrated salt is needed to preserve meat or to treat a wound. And light's the same. A bright, highly focused light is blinding. In the case of a laser, it's literally blinding. But that same laser that can blind us in the hands of a skilled professional can also give us our sight back. And in more typical situations, we're kind of particular about our light. We want just the right amount of light at just the right time for whatever task we're doing at hand so that it's easy on our eyes. It's not too bright and it's not too dim. It's not too focused, it's not too diffused. And all of that has some pretty important implications when it comes to actually being salt and light in the world. Because it's easy enough to think about how important these things are. It's easy enough to say, yeah, we're the light of the world. We like that. And especially in the case of light, we can get caught up in the beauty of that image. But when we actually get down to what it means, to what the nitty-gritty of being salt and the light in the world is like, how we experience that, it gets harder. And it gets harder because we have to use discernment about how we are functioning as salt and light. What are our roles at the moment? What are we doing? Are we preserving something so that it can be used later? Are we being stadium lights? Are we salting soup? Are we being a nightlight for a child? Those questions of what metaphor we're using make a big difference in how we show up to the world with our light. And it also gets harder because we have to try and figure out what is actually speaking the good news of Jesus to the person in front of us. Are we actually being the light that doesn't hurt their eyes, that is a good news to them? Are we actually bringing zest and taste and leaven into their world? Or are we being like the big clump of salt in the middle of the bread that nobody wants to eat? Or the blinding stadium lights? So how do we speak grace to them instead of just speaking in generic phrases? Do we need words or do we need actions? Do we speak now or do we speak later? Or do we find somebody else who's better able to speak to them? And then the hardest part shows up. The fact that neither salt nor light does anything good for its own sake. Salt and light are not for themselves. If you have salt, you can leave it sit on a shelf and it'll still be there in all of its wonderful saltiness 200 years later. Just salt. Not doing anybody any good. And an unobserved lamp, at best, is a waste of fuel. At worst, is a fire hazard. So when we're declared salt and light, we are declared that we exist for something outside of ourselves. No longer light for ourselves, but light for the entire world, indiscriminately. Not light over here where I think that they'd really like it, but light wherever we go. We are light for the whole world. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't ever try and focus our light on one particularly dark spot, but that doesn't mean that that's the only place that gets light because we chose it. Jesus calls us to be light everywhere, to be salt everywhere. As we light the whole world, instead of setting those limits on our lights and being those metaphorical baskets that say, nope, the light goes right here. Because you know what happens when you put a lamp under a basket? Either it gets really dim because just little tiny bits of it are shining through, but more likely it's not going to get enough oxygen and it's going to put the light out, or it's going to catch the basket on fire. So probably one of the last two. It's going to catch the basket on fire, or it's going to put the light out. Or it might just go really, really dim. So when we think about that, we want our light to continue to go out in the world. When we're high quality salt, working in all these different ways, healing, of leavening, of preserving, stabilizing the body, giving zest to all the places that we are. I liked the way it got said in Sunday school this morning. We were talking about what it means to be salt for the world, and they said, being salt in the world is any time you make the world a better place. It's a pretty good way of saying that. Pretty easy. And so very often, being salt and light means that we kind of disappear into our service. Light is very rarely noticed unless it's wrong. Salt is the same way. If we cross over authors, we're in the Gospel of Matthew, but if we cross over to a metaphor from the epistles from Paul calls this dying to ourselves. When we die to ourselves or we disappear into our service, it is only the zest. It is only the healing. It's only the nourishment that came long after the harvest. It's the brightness in the dark moments that is remembered. It's Christ's love which is remembered, and that's what is seen in our light. So as we go through this week, may you be what God declares that you are, a light for the world, salt of the earth. And may you be blessed and having glimpses of what the Holy Spirit does with that. Amen.